What should be included in the labor expense portion of the budget in a grant application for your project, program, or initiative? This is somewhat a simple question that grant writers surprisingly have a lot of leeway in actually answering and articulating to a grantor. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about this, looking at the three primary areas related to the labor or salary or wages, however it's placed in there. And we're going to talk through a few of the variables. So I'm Benjamin Dean from grantgetting.com. I hope you enjoy this video and others like it on the channel, which are aimed at helping you get more grants. So we'll start with direct salaries and wages. So as you're building your narrative, as you're looking at the program from a bit of a higher level, what are we doing and how are we doing it, sort of an articulation of the logic model. There is in every organization typically salaried employees, hourly employees, and there is typically some degree of benefits, payroll taxes, on top of the wages that are paid and received by those individuals or salaries. And then the other category would be consultant or contractor. Okay, so these are sort of the main areas that I'm going to touch on. Most of the time, we're talking about direct salaries and wages. So, in a program for most organizations, they will have one or more programs within the organization, typically more than one. And even if there's one program in an organization, there is still a delineation of what is a program expense or a project expense and what is horribly called overhead or an administrative expense or management or fundraising, right? Program management and fundraising, typically the functional expense breakdown that you're going to be doing at the end of the year for your 990 or for some of your 990 reporting. So that's a good framework to think about. First is every dollar that is spent by the organization will fall, some percentage of that dollar will fall into program, management, fundraising. Okay, and there's other ways to talk about it, but for the sake of this video, that's basically it. So you know now, hopefully you've known this, that needs to be discovered, uncovered, and articulated and reported upon at the end of the year. So knowing that, then you know that within that program bubble, you might have one or more programs, okay, within which every dollar needs to be broken down further, both in terms of a pro forma, a looking forward document, which would be like a budget. Here's our budget for a program, as well as more an accounting, backwards looking uh, document that would say, here's what we actually spent in terms of this program. So as it gets to the grant application, direct salaries and wages, ideally, you have a budget for the year. Now, it could be for any time period, but most of the time you're going to be preparing your budget in November and December for the next year, or the executive director will. And that's being presented to the board, or the board is part of that process. And then, as part of that, there is a breakdown of each program. So, ideally, when you're writing a grant application, it syncs up with your board approved budget. That's ideal. What happens more of the time is that after Q1, things are not exact, right? Already after 3 months of operations, things are not exactly the way that they were articulated in the budget. And they might not be off by too far, but you may have had a staff change. You may have had an unexpected expense here or there. You may have had cost increase or decrease. But in point one here, your direct salaries and wages, that is a top line item for every budget. So one of the things that an auditor, an uppercase A auditor or a lowercase a auditor, any sort of auditing that is done is there's going to be a look at how do the grant budgets correlate to the organizational budget. And that's why many times you'll see in grant applications, there will be a request for the program budget, the budget for this grant, and then another one for the organization. There's at least a check to see, like, does this even, is the grant budget higher than the organizational budget? Is it higher in a particular area? And the main area that we're going to be looking at when as a grant reviewer that we're doing that, we're looking at salaries. Okay, because this is the area that there's a lot of leeway for program managers and grant writers to sort of mix and mingle things, wanting to make sure that the funds are not double counted. Okay, so when you're building your labor or wage or salary line item, you have as a tool your organizational budget or some degree of historical information around projections. The other thing that an organization may find useful is a time study. Okay, so a time study is simply looking at a sampling of a certain amount of time, a week, a month, 3 months, whatever the case is, typically at least a week, where you are having an employee, which potentially is also yourself, actually log the amount of time that they're spending in particular categories of areas. Okay, so that could be programs in general, management and fundraising, those functional expense breakdowns, or you could have employees or yourself that really don't do any management and fundraising or very, very little on the management and administrative side and are really focused on program, and you're drilling down and saying, well, how much time do you spend on this program, on this program, on this program, on this program? So I strongly encourage organizations to do this annually, if not semi-annually, with each employee for at least a week or two. 2 weeks is usually, the longer period of time is better. So 2 weeks is usually a better amount of time to catch more of the ebbs and flows of things. A month is really ideal because you're usually going to capture a whole cycle of activity within a month. The caveats to that would, of course, be months where you do an event or something that you don't do in previous months. But in any case, the logic is you want to take a sampling of if an employee is working 35 hours in a week, what percentage of time is given to each program, management and administration, fundraising, marketing, that sort of breakdown. Once you have that, you can save that into a file that you will be referencing many, 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 many times as a grant writer. And as a grant writer, I think one of your goals, and this is of course a strategic question, but I think one of your goals should be to attempt to get as much, if not all, of your program-related labor, wage, salary expenses covered by grants. Okay, because there is an opportunity to do that no matter what organization you are running or writing grants for. So if that were to be a goal, if there was some other percentage goal that you had, then you would want to track it. Okay, so tracking what you're applying for and what you're receiving is an important step in this process to, one, make sure you're getting as much money in for the organization to cover the salaries as you can on one hand, and on the other hand, of course, making sure that you're not double dipping. You're not getting 3 funders in to fund 175% of this one position. That will be a problem as well that we'll talk about in another video. But this is the sort of framework for direct salaries and wages. You have baseline pro formas, you have a time study, or even if you can't do a full time study. This is not ideal, but you're going to have to estimate, right? Somebody's going to have to come up with a number that says some percentage of time for each expense dollar is spent on every program. So at least if you start those conversations now, it's going to be easier to reference them later. So that's done. Then you're saying, okay, here's my project, here's my program, here's my initiative. And now I know that for this employee, this project manager, they're going to spend 60% of their total time on this project. They have an annual salary of this much. We're going to calculate benefits and payroll taxes into that number, which I'll talk about in a moment. Then you're going to multiply that number by 60. Let's say that number is $100,000 in total, that individual is budgeted and plans to be an expense item for over the course of a 12-month period. You're going to take 60% of that, and that is what you need to cover in terms of that input on the logic model for this program. Okay, it's a very simple calculation. It takes the work on the front end, and a bit on the back end on tracking to be able to get to it being so simple. But once that's done, it's a very, very simple thing. Okay, so you've got that number figured out. It can be applied to both salary and wage. It is really doesn't make that much of a difference. If you have a hourly employee who you, as a manager of that employee or whomever is managing that employee, can actually dictate to them and say, we have you for 30 hours a week, and we would like for you for this 12-week period to allocate 20 out of your 30 hours every week towards this project. You can do that with both salary and with waged folks. But folks that are logging their hours already, it's typically easier to do that because they're in the process of logging their hours or clocking in and out, or have some degree, generally speaking, of more of an awareness of where their time on an hourly basis is going, because that's how they're being paid. It's not always the case with salaried employees. At most nonprofits of small to medium size, they're just doing what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, when it needs to be done. And how many hours do you work? I don't know, right? That's more of the answer on the salaried side. So there needs to be some shifting there, but that's how you do it. And then you have your number. You have your number of a percentage, you have a dollar amount, and you have the logic to back it up. So when it gets to your budget justification, if you can reference time studies in your budget justification as to how you came to that calculation, that's bonus points for sure. That's going to stand out in the minds of the reviewers that understand what more sophisticated organizations do. Many times when you're reading, we'll say a well above average budget and budget justification, there isn't a reference to a time study. What there is a very detailed calculation. This employee, this is the employee's name. This is how much they make per hour. This is their benefit and payroll tax rate. Their we'll call it benefits rate. This is the amount of hours this is the percentage of time that they'll be dedicating to this. This is the amount of time. Is it over 12 months? Is it over 6 months? And here's the calculation, and here's the answer. That's really great. That's justification for the calculation. The justification of why that expense is even in the budget should be able to be referenced in other parts of the application. Okay, so direct salaries and wages, you want to be thinking as you're writing the narrative around the activities that you're going to be undertaking when you get to the section of the grant application that says, describe to us how your project works, or describe the details of your project. You want to write that in answering that question and clearly articulating it, but you also want to write it so that when you get to your budget justification, you can reference it. That this part of the budget justification, this part of the project description is what this employee is responsible for, right? So this is where bullet point lists and very simple numbered lists can be helpful as well. All right, and that's direct salaries and wages. Now, I'll go to point 2, which is benefits and payroll taxes. So this is going to be included typically in the same line item. I have seen plenty of application where it's not, but more times than not, I've seen salaries and wages included in the same line item. On federal grants, on larger grants, that's not the case. But for perhaps what most of us are writing and learning some of this, non-federal grants, they're going to be the same. In either case, you need to figure them out, all right? This goes beyond just the salaries. You'll need to also budget for health insurance, retirement contributions, payroll taxes, fringe benefits, which is a general category, all the things that the professional development is sometimes in here as well. These costs add up. These are everything that the employer is responsible for. And funders do expect to see them in the budget. It is not enough just to list the salary. You're going to be running at a loss. You're going to be imagining yourself to be filling the gap in the budget for the organization, but you're really not. What are all the costs of employing someone? Funders want to know that your budget is comprehensive, and this includes accounting for all employment-related expenses. All right. So this is a whole strategy on the sort of lowercase a accounting side, how things are coded in your bookkeeping software, how you are planning to make expenses and track them. This is a much bigger strategy, but I guess as an overview, as a grant writer, you want to be doing the work that you can to give the organization the best chances at success. And many organizations will not break out other expenses as ones that need to be covered by grants when they could be. So, the two examples that I can think of that are easy to understand is that what constitutes a benefit for an employee from a IRS perspective and tax perspective is not necessarily and doesn't necessarily have to be the exact thing, the exact same definition in any budget, right? Your organization might say, we're going to hire an employee and we're going to pay their health care. We're going to buy them lunch once a week as a team lunch. We're going to offer $2,000 per year in a stipend for professional development. Of course, we're going to pay their payroll taxes, and we're going to offer them an additional $500 a year health stipend that they can use and spend down on health-related expenses. Some of those things count as different categories of benefits from an IRS perspective, but they all count as an organization's decision. So when a grantor is asking you, non-federal grantor is asking you, what is the cost of an employee? Almost all of the time, all of those expenses can be wrapped up into the cost for that employee. Now, if you have any questions about that, you just ask the grantor. Now, this, again, if you have one line item, it's going to say what's the salary, and you're going to calculate in your benefit multiplier is typically what I call it, is to say if you pay somebody $30 an hour, what in terms of like that's what's their hourly rate is, then there's going to be a benefit multiplier, say of 1.2 or 1.15 or 1.25, depending on what that calculation is. So there's a little work in saying this person works 30 hours a week, they get $30 an hour. Here's their total, gross on payment from our point of view. Then we're going to add all these other things in, and then we're going to divide that out. We're going to say all these other things that are not cash payment, compensation in that way, we're going to divide that out. That's going to be a percentage on top of what they're receiving, and that's your percentage or benefits multiplier, right? And then you just sort of use that for that employee or that position in your grant applications, okay? Sometimes you'll want to explain all those things, sometimes you won't need to. All right, so that's an important point to get your head around. The last category is contractor or consultant fees. that we'll talk about here. So in many cases, these are not individuals that are, of course, they're not working full time, they're working part time. And a key difference in a consultant and a contractor is, legally speaking, you cannot dictate to them exactly what to do, when to do it, how to do it. They are coming in somewhat as a freelance individual, making their own decisions on a particular project given a project scope. Okay, so they're not employees. You can't tell them what to do. But sometimes your project may require expertise that your current staff doesn't have. And it could be anything from external evaluation expert to technical consultant, somebody who's being brought in and being asked to develop a proposal to support a particular aspect of a project. If you're hiring a contractor or consultant, your ability to outline their role and the rationale for needing their services, and of course the costs associated, is critical early in the process as you're writing the grant. And there's a bit of a time issue here. So contractors and consultants that are going to come in and say help with setting up a new technical database for your organization. You're applying for funding to upgrade your systems. Well, you're going to need to get a quote from that consultant, given a scope of work that you have in your mind as the grant application is coming together, as the program is coming together. Then there's going to be a big time lag between receiving that, writing the application, submitting the application, hearing back, and then implementing, right? So there could be many, many months in between that conversation and the actual ability to receive those funds to be able to pay that person. Keep that in mind as well. Part of the reason you typically want to get multiple bids, multiple consultants looking at a project before deciding on which one, because it could be in 4 months from now, the one that was most on board and that you liked the most and you felt like was the best fit, they're actually booked up. They had to go find other work, right? They're not going to sit on their hands and wait for you. And I've seen this happen many, many times. So, rule of thumb is 3 bids on any external piece of equipment or consultant, anything external on a grant budget, because of that time lag. But in terms of putting together the portion of the budget that talks about this, this aspect can be beneficial to your organization's application. And that is when you bring in a consultant that has some sort of name recognition with the reviewer, or some sort of competency or credibility factor that really boosts up the credibility of your application. Those things, by actually adding in even a small expense on your budget, you can reference that consultant as an expert in something specific that will allow you as a grant writer to answer questions somewhat differently throughout the application and give you just a little bit more power and sort of autonomy in writing. So even if you had someone, let's say, that was an expert in program evaluation, and again, in terms of a budget, this is maybe the number one thing that is forgotten in the budget is time and effort and whatever specific software and experience that's needed to do a proper program evaluation. That is often forgot. This line item of a consultant, if you have someone in your community that specializes in this, that would be wonderful. Even if you just hired them for a few hours, for a few weeks, to review your plan, your project implementation and program evaluation plan. They reviewed it on the front end, they reviewed it in the middle, they reviewed it in the end. Even if they were purely advisory, you have somebody else looking in at your program. That's great for your program. That's great for your clients. That's going to be super helpful because they're likely going to make improvements for future grants, and you're going to get it paid for, and it's going to actually increase your chances of getting that particular grant where you would get it paid for. It's a big win, 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 win for everybody, and certainly a win for that person who's now being paid just for their advice. okay, and their oversight. Okay, so that's how I would think about the consultant. If you don't have consultants and contractors sort of in your primary budget, so as to say you've built your organizational budget, you've built your program budget, and you don't have consultants in there, this can be a bonus in that sense. This can be something that if you get the money, you'll do it. If not, you'll figure it out without the consultant. But by actually putting it into the budget, given that it fits the scope and sort of funding guidelines, it can actually increase your chances. Okay, so those are some tips on there. You're putting together the labor expense section of your grant budget. You want to think about these things from the organizational budget to the time study to how you are actually calculating benefits and then the strategy around contractors. These are some of the non-traditional things that are really not talked about much when putting these things together. So there's a free download down below in the description that has 10 tips on this topic for creating a stronger labor, wage, salary budget for your grants. Check that out. And if you have any questions about these types of expenses, please leave a comment below and I'd be happy to help. So thank you for jumping into this video and we will see you in the next one.